We are in Isaiah chapter 13, and excuse me. This chapter is dealing with the destruction of Babylon and the return of the Israelites to. So, in verses 17 through verse 22, I titled this section "Some Particulars of Babylon's Destruction." And we've seen that it's going to be by the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Medes in particular, verse 17, and how that they are not going to spare anyone, that the overthrow will be so complete it will be as Sodom and Gomorrah. And that brings us to verse 20, where we will begin this evening. That it shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation, neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there. The desolation of Babylon would be a perpetual desolation, and so much that it would not even be inhabited, that people would not dwell in it from generation to generation. He mentions the Arabians not even pitching their tent there. It would not be a permanent residence for people, and would not even be a temporary resting place for them. Shepherds would not allow their sheep to lie down where the city was. And you have to think back a little bit as to the beauties and the glorious nature of Babylon, and then for it to end up in this type of a situation. It is a total devastation. Well, we will get to that aspect. That's basically the case. When we get through verse 22, or at the end of 22, we'll talk about that in specific. But yes, it is that type of a desolation that even today you have the same type of situation. An amazing prophecy that he is giving here in relationship to all of this, as far as where the city of Babylon is, or was, might be a better term. And if you think of, it was supposedly one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world because of its glorious nature. And now then to be reduced to this that Isaiah is prophesying. And again, remember, when Isaiah is prophesying this, it's before Babylon ever came to power, really. It's while the Assyrians are still in power. They're going to have to be destroyed. Babylon then rises to the world power, and then he's predicting their destruction, and going beyond that it's going to be a perpetual type of destruction. Yeah, Dale? One height to another. Yeah, that's true. Dale?
I read historians back when I read about it that said that some of the historians said that they could ride 4 chariots side by side on top of it, and then other authors said a little bit less. Feet or more tall.
the walls of the city were so wide, supposedly, that they could ride or drive 4 chariots side by side around the walls of the city or on the walls of the city. So that's fairly, that's talking about the fortification of the city, that it was, you can imagine why they thought nobody can ever destroy us. We don't have to worry about it because look at the walls of the city. They were well protected. In verse 22 then, he goes on that the wild beast of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there. So it's going to be uninhabitable for humans, and it's going to be a place for wild animals. That's what it's good for. The King James, where it says wild beast, is simply wild animals. Possibly some have said wild cats or desert creatures. So the term can be used in various ways along that way. Doleful creatures are simply howling beast or howlings. Then owls is possibly ostriches, and satyrs are basically goats. So all of these, though, indicate again that aspect of it's just animals that are there, wild animals, and no human would be there. And so I've lost that again. So Andrew, if you'll scoot it on down to verse 22. And the wild beast of the islands shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant palaces. And her time is near to come, and her days shall not be prolonged. Wild beasts here are probably hyenas. They cry or they howl at night, responding one to another as wolves do at night. The dragons are jackals, living in their pleasant or luxurious palaces. Babylon's time is near to come, and it will not be prolonged. Yet this was about 175 years in the future. The idea sometimes of near is not seen as we see it necessarily. 175 years we would not think of as something that is near. It's rather far on out there. But in relationship to God's dealing with time, it could be, even though it's not talking about this specific type of a situation, 1,000 years is a day, and a day is 1,000 years. In 2 Peter 3. And I say that it's not talking about this type of a situation specifically, but it does show the aspect that with God there is no time. No. And so what might be a long period of time for us might be short. And if you think of eternity, certainly it would be short. What's 175 years, let's say, in relationship to, say, the age of the earth now, which would be probably close to 6,000 to 10,000 years. Well, that's not all that long, is it? If you're talking about 175 years over a period of 10,000 years. So, but he is speaking of Jews that are in captivity, and he's giving them hope. These things are not going to continue, they're going to come to an end. So you don't have to, and maybe I should say he's projecting himself into the future and talking to these individuals who are then in captivity, even though that captivity had not even taken place yet or even started yet. It was yet 100 years in the future. And he's telling them, he's projecting himself into their situation and saying, it's not going to be long. The time's near in which Babylon's going to be destroyed and you'll be released from this. It's not going to be prolonged. So remember that as you consider this idea of the is near to come and days shall not be prolonged. He is projecting himself into the future in regards to this. Wayne Jackson summarizes this in this way. And it's kind of a lengthy quote, but it does, I think it serves well for a summary. The fulfillment of this remarkable prophecy was progressive. After Cyrus invaded Babylon, 539 BC, he substantially left the city standing, making it one of his capital centers for a while. Eventually, though, the city revolted against its captors. Hence, in about 516 BC, Darius, the Persian king, invaded the city and dismantled the walls. In 482 BC, the Babylonian settlement again revolted, which rebellion was put down by Xerxes, with much damage being visited upon the city. Alexander the Great sought to restore the palace or the place to its former glory. He employed 10,000 men for 2 months, clearing away the rubbish in preparation for construction. But he abandoned the project shortly thereafter. In 20 BC, Strabo, the Greek geographer, described Babylon as a, quote, vast desolation, end quote. Documents on clay tablets reveal that a small priestly school continued to operate on the site until about AD 100. And he says, does 1 Peter 5:13 refer to a remnant of the city? The famous archaeologist Henry Lalord, who excavated the area between 1845 to 51, described it as a naked and hideous waste. This amazing prophecy, uttered more than a century before the rise of the Medo-Persian regime, clearly reflects the divine inspiration of this document. So that's the end of Brother Jackson's quote. 1 Peter 5:13 is a reference to, it very quickly just says that the church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus my son. The church that is at Babylon, could that be a reference to that remnant that was left in Babylon? Possibly, possibly not. There's other explanations other than it was the actual physical city of Babylon. Several different ways in which to interpret or to understand that. But you look at this prophecy that's stated here and the total and utter destruction that you see, the prophecy that it's going to be a place that's uninhabitable, basically, that only the animals will reside there. And you consider how far in the future this is that Isaiah is writing it. Now then you come along in really the late 1800s. You have an attack upon the credibility of the Bible and the inspiration of the Bible. You had a combination of theology and the philosophy of the world that basically tried to remove from the Bible any predictive element. So what do you do with something like this? If Isaiah was really the author of it at the time that we date Isaiah, and this is something 150 to 200 years in the future that he's prophesying this, how do you explain it? So what they did, and what they've done with a lot of these books, is they redate them. It really wasn't Isaiah back here at 700 BC. It was someone else who wrote this and used Isaiah's name, and he's writing, in reality, what would have been history for him. And so that way they can explain these predictive prophecies of the Bible that they're really not predictions at all. They're just somebody writing the history. And that way you get away from that the Bible is inspired of God. Because that's the only way you can account for such prophecies as these in Isaiah without admitting that Isaiah was writing by inspiration. There's no other explanation for it. Either he was writing by the inspiration of God, that God was directing him in these things, or else somebody else had to write it and just use Isaiah's name. So that's what you're left with in reality as to the options as to account for these things. So, chapter 14. I told Paul we'd get into chapter 14 tonight. I'm not sure he believed it or not, but in chapter 14, the first 3 verses, we're continuing with the fall of Babylon. And the first 3 verses Babylon's fall will mean the release of Israel, is the way in which I titled the first 3 verses of chapter 14. In verse 1 then, for the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and yet will choose Israel and set them in his own land, and strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. The destruction of Babylon would mean the restoration of God's people, here referred to as Jacob. and Israel. That he's using these two, Jacob and Israel, for God's people, the Israelites. They all, of course, came from the fleshly sons of Jacob. And if you wanted to go back and study Genesis 35, verses 22 through 26, you would see that. His name is changed to Israel when? Remember?
Genesis 32.
Okay, what is that though? It's in Genesis 32, yes, verse.
When he wrestled with this man that was really an angel.
Okay, when his encounter with the angel and his overcoming the angel in a sense, and thus the angel changes his name from Jacob to Israel, and that's Genesis 32 verses 24 through 28. And so when he uses Jacob and yet chooses Israel, he's dealing with God's chosen people, the Israelites. And because of God's compassion on his people, they will return. God will set them to their own land. They would also be joined with strangers that would join with them in returning to Israel or to Palestine. Their cleaving to the house of Jacob shows they, being the strangers, shall cleave to the house of Jacob, that he's dealing with proselytes to the Jewish religion. Gentiles who decided to become Jews. For men, there was a process of becoming a Jew in relationship to a Gentile. He had to be circumcised and he was baptized. Baptism is not something that was a New Testament idea. It was something that was done already, but it was done in relationship to the Gentiles becoming a Jew. They were baptized. It does seem that way, that they recognized a birth, but more from a physical standpoint, that they were becoming Jews. They were being born into the Jewish religion as a Gentile. Dale, you...
I wanted to ask a question. I hope you don't think it's an unusual question. You know when it says in the first verse, it uses house of Jacob and house of Israel like interchangeably, and like in Acts chapter 15, when James is speaking, he talks about the house of Jacob, the tabernacle of David, and he quotes from Amos 9:11-12. Would the house of Israel and Jacob in this context have any connection as far as marrying each other or explaining each other in comparison to that prophecy in Jerusalem conference?
I don't see any connection there.
Connection at all?
I don't see any. There, if somebody does, I mean, that's them, but I don't see any. Mm-hmm. There is a great deal of comfort in this. And there's a principle as well that God is always faithful. The faithfulness of God. God's faithful in everything that he does. His dealings with Israel, he was faithful with them. And now then he promised to be with them. He promised to care for them, protect them, all these other aspects in relationship to Israel. And here's God's. Now, even though you're going to be taken into captivity, God's still going to be with you. And he's still going to care for you. And he's going to restore you to the land.
That goes all the way back to his promise to Abraham.
His promise to Abraham, a threefold promise in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. A great nation, a land, and in thee shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Well, he was giving them the land, but also he was going to now return them to the land for that promise of a Redeemer, someone to bless the world. Albert Barnes writes about the idea of the strangers here, the proselytes. And he says, we know that in subsequent times many of other nations became proselytes, and that multitudes of the Egyptians, the Macedonians, the Romans, the inhabitants of Asia Minor embraced the Jewish religion or became what were called proselytes of the gate. They were circumcised and were regarded as entitled to a part of the privileges of the Jewish people. And he says, see Acts 2, verses 9 through 11, and compare that with Acts 17, verse 4 and verse 17. In Acts 2, it's just giving a list of all of the nations that were at Jerusalem at the time, and he concludes that list with proselytes. Jews and proselytes. So there were proselytes of all nations. So it was something that was common as far as people becoming Jews. In verse 2 then, he says, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaidens, and they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. The people would include Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. So the people, these three in particular, Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, would take them, that is, Jacob or Israel, and bring them to their place, to Jerusalem. Cyrus the Great authorized the return of Jews from Babylon, or from Babylonian captivity. We see that in Ezra chapter 1. Then Darius helped in rebuilding the temple. We read that in Ezra chapter 6. Artaxerxes then permitted Nehemiah to return and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And we read that in Nehemiah chapter 2. The captivity of the Israelites occurred in 3 stages. The first of that stage began at 606. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were carried away in that captivity at 606. Then there was a rebellion by the Israelites again, and in 597 there was a second carrying away or destruction, and then a final destruction in 586 BC. So 3 stages of this captivity. Jeremiah speaks of 70 years of captivity. That 70 years begins at 606, not the 586 in the destruction. That captivity began at 606 date. And thus, the years, you have the return. But the return was again in 3 stages. If you take 70 from 606, what do you have?
536, 537 or something like that?
536. 606 minus 70 is 536. So that's the beginning stages, or the beginning stage of the return. That's the return under Zerubbabel and those that were with him, and that was done by Cyrus the Great, recorded in Ezra chapter 1. The second stage of the return took place in 458 BC, and that's the return that Darius allowed in rebuilding the temple. Again, 3 stages. The first one, you can return to Jerusalem. The second stage, you can rebuild the temple. The third stage, which takes place in 444 BC, that's the one in which Artaxerxes allowed Nehemiah to return along with others, and they were permitted to rebuild the walls of the city. So those 3 aspects of the return. And if you read in Nehemiah, you see the opposition that the Samaritans really brought against Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls of the city, and they put a stop to it. And they sent a message back to the king. If you permit this, they're going to rebel. Those people have been a rebellious people, and they fought against all the kings, and they just, you're going to have trouble. And so they put a stop to it for a while, until they did some research into the history and saw that, it was permitted, and it was going to be allowed. But those are the dates of both the captivity and the return from captivity.
While they were captive, they could have that kind of influence over the that they would become proselytes. And they didn't have to force them to be their servitude, but bring them back with them and serve under them, and they would become their ruler. How much influence could we in this world have over our enemies?
That's a interesting point, isn't it? That if they had such influence over them, why don't we have influence over the ones that are our enemies? We are to be a light in a world of darkness. If you walk into a dark room and you turn on a light, what happens? You stay in the dark, don't you? No. It lights up the whole room, doesn't it? That's what we're to be in the world around us.
And the darker the dark, the brighter the small light. If you go into a cave, a real cave, turn on all the lights and just like one little candle, it puts out a lot
It puts out a lot more light than what you can ever imagine. If it is pitch black and there is absolutely no light, and you light one little candle, it's going to put out a lot of light. And that's what we as Christians are to be in the world around us. Noah Hackworth notes, though, in this regard on this verse, that there is no evidence that Israel enslaved others, so this statement must be figurative. The phrase obviously means those who would become Israel's servants and handmaids would become such subsequent to being proselyted into the Jewish religion. There were only two ways of gaining access into God's family in the Old Testament: by being physically born into it, or by becoming a proselyte. He mentions Matthew 23:15 and 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5. Through the impartation of truth, Israel would rule over her oppressors. And so he says this is figurative in its usage, that through the truth, that's what rules or causes Israel to rule over her oppressors. Not a physical military type ruling over them, but a ruling over them with truth. We could add in relationship to ourselves, aren't we to rule over the world with truth and right and justice? That's what we are to be in relationship to Christians. And when we convert those individuals in the world to that which is right, in that sense, we are over them. We are not in the sense of oppressors in that sense, but we are oppressing them because we've oppressed that evil and that sin that is in their life, to where they are now doing that which is right and good. So that's the idea that is being expressed here. Andrew, if you'll move that to verse 3. It shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and from thy fear and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve. God promises in this rest for all of the sorrow, fear, and hard bondage during the 70 years of captivity and oppression. As I mentioned before, the captivity began at 606. The first return was at 536. 70 years of oppression, of bondage, and fear during that time. God's promising rest from that now. The day seems to be a clear reference to Ezekiel 28, verses 25 and verse 26. Somebody want to turn over there and read that passage? Ezekiel 28, verses 25 and 26. Yeah, go ahead.
Thus saith the Lord God, when I shall have gathered the house of Israel from the people among whom they are scattered, and shall be sanctified in them in the sight of the heathen. Then shall they dwell in their land that I have given to my servant Jacob, and they shall dwell safely therein, and shall build houses and plant vineyards. Yea, they shall dwell with confidence when I have executed judgments upon all those that despise them round about them, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God.
Okay. Here's when the Lord gathers Israel from among the people that they've been scattered. Well, when they were scattered during that Babylonian captivity, then they are being gathered back, Ezekiel is saying, and going to be sanctified in the sight of the heathen. They will dwell in the land, dwell safely therein, shall build houses, plant vineyards, and so forth. That's the time, that's the day that is being discussed here by Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is writing, again, and we've noted this in these two chapters, Isaiah is writing as if they've already returned. So he is projecting himself far in the future. And saying, you've already returned. And God's giving you rest. Let me, verse 4. It says, thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. And verses 4 through verse 11 really is rest given to the world for a period at least, is the way in which I title it. This is basically a taunt song, taunting, of triumph, which is the same thing that you had happened after the release from Egypt in Exodus 15 and the Song of Miriam. You can also look at Micah chapter 2 and verse 4 and Habakkuk 2 and verse 6. Here it's being uttered against the king of Babylon and celebrating the destruction of their enemy of Babylon. The Golden City. It's an interesting discussion. There are two readings that are actually seen here. Madhaba and Merhaba. The latter reading, it says, was preferred anciently and is followed by the Septuagint, the Syriac and the Chaldee versions, the Targums, Ewald and Gesenius, and Mr. Cheyenne. It would give the meaning, the raging one. Madhaba, however, is preferred by Rosenmuller and Vitringa and Dr. K. It is supposed to mean golden, from Dahab, the Chaldean form of the Hebrew Zayab, which is gold. But the question is pertinent, why should a Chaldee form have been used by a Hebrew writer ignorant of Chaldee and the Chaldea? So there are, in this where it says the golden city, there is those who would argue that this should be the raging city or the raging one. But in all probability, as King James has, it would be more likely the golden city. Jamieson Fawcett Brown in their commentary says rather the extractness of gold instead of the golden city, but the extractness of gold. But then they go on to say, but the older translations read differently in the Hebrew. Oppression, which is a parallelism, favors, and he says, notice chapter 3 and verse 5. However one might understand the golden city ceased, it's still about the king of Babylon. We'll, since Andrew's already rang the second bell and they're waiting to come in, we'll start with verse 5. But remember verse 4, this is against the king of Babylon, because that will be important later on in this chapter.